The little girl was standing on the porch with a fistful of yellow wildflowers, and Joel Whitfield felt the ground shift beneath his boots as surely as if the earth itself had cracked open. He stood at the corner of the barn, one hand braced against the weathered wood, unable to move. His daughter, 6-year-old Nora, had her small arm outstretched toward the woman sitting on the porch steps, her chin tipped up with the same stubborn pride her mother had carried, and her fingers were wrapped tight around a bouquet of black-eyed Susans that she had clearly picked from the field beside the creek. The same field where she used to pick flowers with her mother. The same field Joel had found her sitting in alone, weeping, 3 months after the funeral, when she had told him in a voice so small it nearly broke him that she would never pick flowers for anyone ever again, because flowers were for Mama and Mama was gone. That had been 2 years ago. Joel had not realized he was holding his breath until his chest began to ache. The woman on the steps, Olive Brooks, reached out and took the flowers with both hands, cupping them gently as if they were made of something precious and fragile. She did not say anything at first. She just looked at them, and then she looked at Nora, and her dark eyes were full of something Joel could not name, something that was warm and wide open and entirely unguarded, and he watched his daughter take one small step closer and lean against this woman's shoulder as if she had always belonged there. Joel pressed his fist to his mouth and looked away. He had made a terrible mistake bringing Olive Brooks to his ranch. He understood that now with a certainty that hit him like a fist to the ribs. Not because she was dangerous, she wasn't. Not because she was dishonest. She had been nothing but straightforward since the moment she stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, 3 weeks ago. But because he had told himself this was a practical arrangement, a contract, a solution to the problem of a motherless child and a ranch that needed a woman's hand. He had told himself he did not need to feel anything. He had told himself he was immune. Standing at the corner of his barn in the late August heat of 1878, watching his daughter offer yellow wildflowers to a woman he had barely allowed himself to look at directly for 3 entire weeks, Joel Whitfield understood that he had lied to himself about every single one of those things. He had to go back to the beginning to understand how he had arrived at this precise moment of unraveling. It had started, as most things in Joel's life did, with a letter. The summer of 1878 had been brutal across the Kansas plains. The drought that had tormented the region since late spring had not broken by July, and the grass in the lower pastures was thin and yellow, crackling underfoot like old paper. Joel had lost 2 cows to the heat and 1 good horse to a rattlesnake bite, and the fence on the north side of the property had come down in a wind that blew hard and mean out of the northwest and did not apologize for itself. He had been awake before 4 every morning for 3 months, and by the time he fell into bed each night he was so bone-tired that he slept without dreaming, which was the only mercy the summer had offered him. His daughter was another matter. Nora was 8 years old that summer, and she was fierce and quick, and sometimes so much like her mother that Joel had to look away when she tilted her head a certain way or pressed her lips together in concentration over something she was trying to figure out. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's stubborn jaw, and her mother's habit of going very quiet when she was hurt instead of crying, which Joel found infinitely harder to deal with than tears. She had adjusted to life without her mother with the grim practicality of a frontier child who had no choice, but there were shadows in her that Joel recognized because he carried the same ones, and he did not know how to reach into that dark place and pull her out of it. Mrs. Hartley, who lived 6 miles north and came by twice a week to help with the house and with Nora, had been the one to finally say what Joel had been circling around for months. "That child needs a mother," Mrs. Hartley had said, not unkindly, one morning in early June while she was rolling out pie dough at the kitchen table. "She needs a woman's presence in this house, Joel. She needs someone to teach her things I don't have the time to teach her and that you don't know how to teach her. She's getting older, and the things she's going to need, you can't give her all of them by yourself." Joel had not argued. He was too tired to argue, and he suspected she was right. He had written to a correspondence agency in St. Louis that his neighbor and friend, Pete Calloway, had mentioned over a fence one afternoon. Pete had found his second wife through a similar arrangement 4 years back, and had been happily married to her ever since, which Joel privately considered a remarkable outcome, given how the whole business sounded on the surface. The agency matched ranchers and farmers and men of steady means on the frontier with women from the East who were looking for new lives and honest marriages. It was a practical arrangement, the agency's letter assured him. Both parties entered with clear expectations. There was nothing shameful or secretive about it. Joel had written a straightforward letter. He had described the ranch, which was 340 acres of good land outside of Caldwell with a solid house and a working well and a barn that needed a new roof on the east side. He had described himself 34 years old, widower, one daughter aged 8. He had said he was not looking for romance or passion or anything complicated. He was looking for a capable woman who was kind to children, who could manage a household, and who would be treated with respect and provided for without question. He had not made it sound romantic because he had not intended it to be. The agency had written back within 3 weeks and enclosed a letter from a woman named Olive Brooks. Joel had read her letter 3 times that evening after Nora was in bed. She was 26 years old, she wrote. She had been born in Ohio and had spent the last 4 years in Missouri working as a schoolteacher in a small town called Harrisburg. She had never been married. She was not, she said with a directness that had startled him pleasantly, looking for a fairy story. She was looking for a place where she could be useful and where she could build something solid with someone who was honest about what he needed. She liked children very much, she wrote, which was perhaps obvious given her profession but worth stating plainly. She had no family left to speak of. Her parents had both passed, and she had no siblings, which meant there was no one in Missouri who would suffer from her relocation. She could cook, sew, manage accounts, tend a kitchen garden, and teach a child to read above her grade level. Then she had written one more line at the bottom of the letter, below her signature, almost as an afterthought. She had written, "I should tell you that I am not a delicate woman. I have managed difficult things on my own, and I know what hard work looks like, and I am not afraid of it. I just want you to know that before you decide anything." That last paragraph had made Joel set the letter down on the table and stare at the lamp for a long time. He had written back that evening. The correspondence that followed over the next 6 weeks was not what Joel had expected. He had expected practical exchanges, logistics, timelines, arrangements, and those things were discussed. But Olive Brooks also asked him questions he had not anticipated, and she asked them with a directness that stripped away all the polite fencing he was accustomed to. She asked him what his daughter was like. She asked him what the land smelled like in summer. She asked him whether the nearest town had a doctor, not out of fear, she clarified, but because she liked to know where the nearest doctor was, a habit developed from years of teaching children in places where emergencies happened. And then in the 4th letter, she had asked him something that had stopped him cold. She had written, "You haven't mentioned your wife except to note that she passed. You don't have to tell me anything about her. But I want you to know that I'm not trying to replace her, and I wouldn't want you to feel like I was. Whatever she meant to this household and to your daughter, I would want to understand that and respect it, not bury it." Joel had not been able to write back for 4 days. When he finally did, he told her that his wife's name had been Clara. He told her that Clara had died of fever in the autumn of 1876, 2 years before, and that she had been 29 years old, and that she had loved this land in a way that was almost religious, the way some people loved churches. He told her that Nora still kept a ribbon of Clara's on her nightstand, and that sometimes at night, when the house was quiet, he heard his daughter talking softly to a person who was no longer there, and that he had never known whether to interrupt or let her be. He told her all of this, and then he sealed the letter quickly before he could take any of it back. Olive's response had taken 8 days to arrive, which was longer than her usual turnaround, and by the time her letter came, Joel had told himself he was not waiting for it and had almost convinced himself this was true. She had written, "Thank you for trusting me with Clara." And then she had written 3 more pages about Harrisburg and the schoolchildren she was leaving behind, and a particular student named Thomas who had been a terror in September and a reader by February, and who had brought her an apple on her last day with such a solemn face that she had cried on the road out of town. She had written about the particular loneliness of being a capable woman in a world that sometimes treated capability in women as a problem to be managed rather than a quality to be valued. She had written these things with a dry humor that made him smile in spite of himself, alone at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He had written back within the hour. The arrangement was made. Olive Brooks would arrive in Caldwell on the afternoon stage on the second Tuesday of August, 1878. Joel would meet her there. If both parties were in agreement after meeting, the wedding would take place at the end of the week before the local preacher left on his circuit. If either party found the arrangement unsuitable upon meeting, there would be no hard feelings and the agency would cover Olive's return fare. Joel had told himself he was relieved to have the matter settled. He had not told himself, or anyone else, that he had read her last letter so many times that the paper had softened at the folds. The morning he drove into Caldwell to meet the stage, Joel dressed with more care than he had taken with his appearance in 2 years. He put on his good shirt and his newer boots, and he ran a comb through his hair, and then stood in front of the small mirror in his bedroom and felt vaguely ridiculous. He was a tall man, wide through the shoulders, with hands that were permanently stained at the knuckles from working the land, and his face had the particular weathered quality that Kansas sun imposed on everyone who spent time outdoors. He was not a vain man, and he did not think of himself as handsome, but he was at least clean and he was at least on time, and that would have to be sufficient. Nora had insisted on coming with him. She had put on her second-best dress without being asked, and had braided her own hair in a fashion that was somewhat crooked but clearly attempted, and she had sat in the wagon beside Joel on the drive into town with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward. She had not said a word about Olive Brooks. She had not said a word about the arrangement at all since Joel had told her about it 2 weeks earlier. She had simply listened to his explanation, that a woman was coming to help with the house, that she was a teacher, that she was nice, and then she had gone outside and Joel had heard nothing further from her on the subject. He did not know if this was acceptance or resistance dressed up to look like silence, and with Nora, the distinction was never easy to identify. The stage was 12 minutes late. Joel stood at the edge of the boardwalk in the August heat with his hat in his hands and watched the dust cloud on the road south of town resolve itself into the Caldwell stage, and he felt his stomach do something it had not done in a very long time, which was absolutely none of his business. The stage stopped. 2 men climbed out. A woman in a gray traveling dress climbed out after them and stood on the street and looked around with the focused, unhurried attention of a person taking inventory of a new situation, and Joel knew immediately, without having to ask, that this was Olive Brooks. She was not what he had imagined, though he had told himself he hadn't imagined anything. She was of medium height, with dark brown hair that was pinned up under a modest hat, and she had a strong, clear face that was not conventionally pretty in the soft sense that word sometimes implied, but was arresting in the way of a face that was fully inhabited by the person behind it. Her eyes were very dark, nearly black from a distance, and they swept the street with a calm, observant directness that reminded him immediately of the woman he had been reading in those letters. She had a single traveling trunk and a worn leather satchel over one shoulder, and she was looking at the street with an expression that was careful and steady, and absolutely without any evidence of the nervousness that Joel himself was currently managing with great difficulty. He walked toward her. She saw him when he was still 10 feet away, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight loosening around the eyes, something that might have been relief. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Welcome to Caldwell." There was a pause that was not quite comfortable but was also not terrible, and then Nora appeared from behind Joel's left elbow, which startled him because he had not heard her move. His daughter looked at Olive Brooks with the flat, assessing gaze that she reserved for things she was not yet sure about, the same look she had given the new horse before she decided she liked him. Olive looked back at Nora. She did not crouch down in that forced, overeager way that adults sometimes did with children to signal friendliness. She did not speak to her in a high-pitched, simplified voice. She simply met Nora's gaze with the same steady directness she had turned on the street and said, "You must be Nora. I'm Olive. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Nora said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Your hair is messy." Joel closed his eyes. Olive reached up and touched the side of her hat with a dry expression. "That's what happens when you ride in a stage for 6 hours," she said. "I expect the same would happen to yours." Nora considered this with the gravity of a judge reviewing testimony. Then she turned and climbed back into the wagon without another word. Joel apologized. Olive told him there was nothing to apologize for. They collected her trunk and loaded it into the wagon and drove out of Caldwell toward the ranch, and the conversation that passed between them on that drive was quiet and somewhat careful, the conversation of two people who had been honest on paper and were now figuring out what that honesty looked like in person. Nora sat in the back of the wagon and said nothing, but Joel caught her, more than once, watching Olive with those dark, measuring eyes. The first week had been awkward in the precise way that Joel had expected, and uncomfortable in some ways he had not. Olive had moved into the house with a quiet competence that he found simultaneously reassuring and unsettling, because she managed to make the kitchen feel different, more organized, more alive with small details he couldn't fully identify without making him feel as if anything had been taken away or replaced. She cooked well. She was patient with Nora in a way that was neither soft nor harsh, a steady, consistent patience that did not waver when Nora was difficult, which was often, and did not smother when Nora seemed to want space, which was also often. She kept the house accounts with careful attention, and found a mistake in Joel's August ledger with a quiet tact that made him feel corrected rather than embarrassed, which was a skill he had not known he respected until she demonstrated it. She and Joel were married on the Friday of that first week, in a ceremony that lasted 15 minutes in the front parlor with the circuit preacher and Pete Calloway and Pete's wife Margaret as witnesses. It was a plain, serious ceremony with no particular ornamentation, and when it was over, Olive had shaken the preacher's hand with a directness that made him blink, and Margaret Calloway had embraced her warmly, and Nora had stood in the doorway eating a biscuit and watching everything with an expression that gave nothing away. Joel and Olive had agreed, before the wedding, that theirs would be a marriage of partnership and respect and mutual honesty, and that neither of them would make demands of the other that went beyond the arrangement they had both entered willingly. He had moved his things to the smaller bedroom and given Olive the larger one, and she had thanked him without making an issue of it in either direction, and they had both understood that the terms of their arrangement were what they were, and they were practical, and they were fine. What Joel had not factored into the terms was the particular and specific problem of Olive Brooks at the kitchen table in the evening, with her dark hair unpinned and falling loose over one shoulder, reading by lamplight with her feet tucked up under her and a cup of coffee at her elbow. Or the way she laughed, low and sudden, when something genuinely struck her as funny, as if the laugh surprised her on the way out. Or the way she listened, not just heard, but listened, when Joel talked about the land or the stock or the things he worried about in the middle of the night, with the focused, present attention of someone who was actually interested in what was being said rather than waiting for her own turn to speak. He had managed for 3 weeks to keep all of these observations at a careful distance from anything he was willing to call feeling. And then Nora had handed her a fistful of yellow wildflowers on a Tuesday afternoon, and the ground had moved. Joel did not go to the porch immediately. He stayed at the barn and pretended to be doing something with the harness until he was sure he had recovered sufficient composure, which took longer than it had any right to. When he finally walked back toward the house, his face arranged in its usual neutral expression, Nora was no longer on the porch, but the screen door was bouncing gently on its hinges, and he could hear her inside at the table. And Olive was still sitting on the steps with the yellow flowers in her lap, her head tipped back slightly, her eyes closed against the late sun. She opened them when she heard his boots on the dirt. "Picked those herself," Joel said, because he had to say something. Olive looked down at the flowers in her hands. "I know. She told me where she found them." He sat down on the step beside her, which was not something he had done before, and the proximity of it felt different than it usually did when they sat across from each other at the table. The afternoon heat was beginning to break, and the air had that particular quality it got in late August, warm and full and faintly sweet with dry grass. The field stretched out ahead of them, pale gold and enormous under the wide Kansas sky. "She hasn't picked flowers for anyone since her mother died," he said. He hadn't meant to say it quite so directly. It came out before he could arrange it into something more managed. Olive was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know that." "No," he said. "I should have told you. I don't know why I didn't." He paused. "I think I didn't know how to explain it without explaining more than I was ready to explain." She looked at him then, not with the careful, measured look she sometimes used when she was taking inventory of a situation, but with something more open than that, something that made him feel very directly seen in a way he was not entirely prepared for. "She's a remarkable child," Olive said. "She's exactly like her mother," Joel said, and it came out with a weight that surprised him because he had said that sentence before to other people, to Pete, to Mrs. Hartley, and it had always sounded like grief. But when he said it now, sitting next to Olive in the late afternoon light with yellow wildflowers between them, it sounded like something else too. Something that existed alongside the grief but was not the same thing. Olive looked back at the fields. "That must be hard sometimes." "Yes," he said, "and sometimes it's the only thing that makes this place still feel like home." Neither of them said anything else for a while, and the silence was not the careful, polite silence of two people who were still establishing the terms of their coexistence. It was a different kind of silence, warm and full of the evening sounds of the ranch, the horses moving in the paddock, the dry scraping of the wind through the grass, a mockingbird carrying on somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. Joel became aware, sitting in that silence, that something had shifted between them that afternoon, something whose full weight he was not yet certain he wanted to measure. He stood up, brushed the dust off his trousers, and said that he had better check the horses before dark, which was true, and went and did that with more deliberate focus than the horses strictly required. But the thing that had shifted did not go back to where it had been. In the days that followed, Joel watched Olive and Nora with a new kind of attention, the way you watch something fragile and important that you are afraid to disturb by looking at it too directly. They did not rush toward each other. Nora was too much her mother's daughter for that, too watchful and too self-contained to offer trust lightly. But something had changed after the flowers, and whatever invisible barrier Nora had maintained in those first weeks had quietly moved. It started with small things. Nora began appearing in the kitchen in the mornings before Joel came in from the barn, and he would find her sitting across the table from Olive with her elbows on the wood and her chin in her hands, watching Olive make breakfast with the focused attention she gave to things she was learning. She did not ask for lessons exactly, but she began hovering in the way that children hover when they want to be included in something without having to admit they want it. And Olive responded to this by simply beginning to hand her things. The wooden spoon, the biscuit cutter, the tin of flour, without making a ceremony of it. Within a week, Nora was making biscuits with a competence that would have surprised Joel if he had not already watched her develop competencies in other things with the same silent, fierce determination. She did not compliment Olive's teaching. She did not thank her in words. But one morning Joel came in from the barn and found a biscuit with a small carved flower pressed into the top sitting on the edge of the table next to Olive's coffee cup, separate from the others, and Olive was pretending not to have noticed it, which was the most tactful and intelligent thing he had ever seen a person do. He caught Olive's eye over Nora's head, and something passed between them that was quick and quiet and full of warmth, and Joel turned away toward the stove faster than necessary and found the back of his neck inexplicably warm. The other thing that began to happen, more slowly and with more resistance on his part, was that Olive and Joel began to talk in the evenings. It had begun practically enough. They needed to discuss the household, the stock, the accounts, the fence on the north side that still needed repair, the particular problem of the dry creek bed, and whether it was worth digging it deeper before autumn. These were legitimate topics that required legitimate conversation, and Joel engaged with them willingly because they were safe and manageable and connected to things he understood. But the conversations kept going past the practical matters. Joel was not entirely sure how this kept happening or who was responsible for it, though he suspected it was both of them in equal measure, each pulling the thread a little further, each question answered with something that opened rather than closed. She told him about her parents, who had been farmers in Ohio and good people, but worn people, ground down by the relentless work of building something on land that did not give easily. She told him about the particular loneliness of being the only child of two parents who had run out of extra feeling after the work was done each day, not because they were cold, but because there was nothing left. She told him that she had become a reader early and a teacher deliberately, because books and children were the two things that had consistently felt to her like the world had more in it than what she could see from her particular window. She told him about Missouri and Harrisburg, and the 2 years she had spent there feeling increasingly like something was waiting for her somewhere that was not that town, and about the particular afternoon she had read the agency's notice in the newspaper and had told herself she was not going to write to anyone, and then had sat down and written to the agency that same evening, because she was tired of telling herself things that were not true. Joel had laughed at that, a real laugh, unexpected, and Olive had looked at him with a pleased surprise that made him feel warm in a way he immediately tried to be practical about. He told her things too, more than he had intended, more than he had told anyone in the 2 years since Clara died. He told her about the ranch and how he had built it. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee at 22, with money saved from 4 years of working other men's land, and he had bought his 340 acres and built the house himself with the help of 2 men he had paid in whiskey and promises and had fulfilled both. He told her about Clara, how they had met at a church supper in Caldwell in 1869, and how Clara had told him within the first 10 minutes of conversation that she found his silence irritating, and that she would appreciate it if he could use more words, and how he had fallen in love with her on the strength of that specific observation, because it was so exactly right about him. He told her that Clara had loved the land in a way that had taught him how to love it better, that her particular way of seeing things, the color of the sky at different times of day, the way the light moved across the fields in different seasons, small things he had always noted practically but never felt, had given him a language for his own attachment to this place that he had not had before. He told her that losing Clara had been like losing access to a room inside himself that he didn't know he'd had until it was locked, and that he had managed since then by not trying the door. Olive had listened to all of this without interrupting, which was something very few people did, and when he was finished she had said, quietly, "I think Clara would have liked knowing that you described it that way." Joel had not been able to respond to that for a long moment. Then he had said, She would have also told me I took too long getting to the point. Olive had smiled at that, and it was a smile he was beginning to understand had different gradations. The polite smile, the dry smile, the small private smile that meant something had actually reached her. This was the small private one. He catalogued it without meaning to, and stored it somewhere he tried not to examine too carefully. The fence on the north side came down again in the second week of September during a windstorm that came in hard from the northwest, and left the pasture looking like something had thrown a fist through it. Joel was out in the dark repairing it at 11 o'clock at night when the lantern he was using simply ran out of fuel without warning, and left him in the black with 2 fence posts and a coil of wire. He heard Olive before he saw her. She was coming across the dark pasture with a fresh lantern and his heavy coat, which she had correctly identified as the thing he was not wearing that he needed most, and she picked her way through the grass with the steady confidence of a woman who was not afraid of dark fields, and she handed him the coat and the lantern, and held the light while he finished the fence posts. They did not talk much while he worked. She simply held the light where he needed it and handed him things when he needed them. And there was a particular intimacy to this, working together in the dark with nothing around them, but the sound of the wind and the distant horses and the occasional far-off bark of a coyote, that sat in Joel's chest in a way that was increasingly difficult to classify as practical or contractual or anything other than what it was. When the fence was done, he straightened and found her standing very close, the lantern held between them, her face half-lit and entirely serious, and her dark eyes looking at him with something she was not bothering to conceal. He was aware of how close she was. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he found professionally inconvenient. "Olive," he said, and then stopped because he had not decided what he was going to say after her name. She looked at him steadily. She did not look away, which would have been easier for both of them. She did not say anything either, which was somehow harder. "I think," he said very carefully, "that I am in considerable difficulty." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I believe I am as well." The wind moved through the grass around them. Neither of them moved. "I don't know what to do with that," he said honestly. "Neither do I," she said. "But I'd rather know it was true than pretend it wasn't." That was such a completely Olive Brooks thing to say, direct and clear, and refusing the easier option of comfortable pretense, that something in his chest loosened in a way he hadn't anticipated. He exhaled. He almost reached for her hand and then did not, partly because he wasn't sure he had the right and partly because he suspected that if he touched her he would not be able to continue being careful, and he needed, for reasons that had to do with fairness and honesty and the terms they had both agreed to be careful for a little longer. He said, "Can we talk about it? When it's not 11 at night in a broken pasture," she said. "Yes, I'd like that." They walked back to the house with the lantern between them and their shoulders, almost but not quite touching, and Joel put the coat away and the lantern away, and they said good night at the hallway, and he lay in the narrow bed in the smaller room and stared at the ceiling for what felt like the rest of the night, which was probably only 2 hours but felt longer. And he understood with considerable clarity that the arrangement he had entered for purely practical reasons had ceased. At some indeterminate point in the past few weeks, to be purely anything. They had the conversation the next evening. Nora had gone to bed after supper, which she did without complaint when she was genuinely tired, which she was that evening after a day that had included chasing chickens and helping Joel carry water from the well, and getting into an argument with the rooster that she had won on points if not on dignity. Joel and Olive sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the supper between them and the lamp turned low, and the house had that late evening quiet that fell over the plains like a second dark. Joel said, "I want to be honest with you." Olive said, "I would expect nothing less. When I wrote to the agency," he said, "I told myself I was looking for a practical arrangement, a solution. I told myself I was done with the other kind of thing. I want you to understand that I meant that when I said it, and that it wasn't deception on my part." "I know that," she said, "but I don't think it's entirely true anymore," he said. And I don't think it's been true for a while. And I think you deserve to know that, even if I'm not entirely sure what to do about it, because you were honest with me from the beginning, and I want to be the same kind of honest with you." Olive looked at him across the table with the expression he had learned was her most unguarded, the one where she was not managing anything or measuring anything, just present and entirely herself. She said, "When I wrote that letter in Harrisburg, I told myself I was looking for something practical too, and I meant it the same way you did. And then I got your letter about Clara and what she meant to you, and I sat with that letter for a long time, and I thought, there is a man who is capable of loving something completely, and the fact that he is hurting is proof of that capacity, not the end of it." Joel was very still. "I didn't come here with intentions," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I was not trying to change the terms of what we agreed to. But I am also not going to pretend that what I feel when I sit across the table from you is the same as what I feel when I'm balancing accounts." Something that had been very tightly wounded in Joel's chest for a very long time simply let go. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, carefully, the way you put your hand on something you want to make sure is real. Her hand turned under his and her fingers closed around his, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that were full and clear and entirely without ambiguity. And Joel thought that he had been told, at 22, by a very old man on a very long road, that the second time you let yourself love something, you do it differently than the first time, not less, but with the particular knowledge of someone who has lost and survived losing. And that this makes the thing itself different in quality if not in amount. He thought the old man had been right. "I would like to try," he said, which was not a fully elegant declaration, but it was true. "So would I," she said, which was all either of them needed. He did not kiss her that night. There was something he wanted to do first. The following morning Joel got up before dawn and walked to the field by the creek while the sky was still the pale gray of just before light, and he stood in the damp grass for a while and talked to Clara. Not aloud, exactly, but in the way he had learned to do in the years since she died, the interior conversation that was more feeling than words. He told her about Olive. He told her what Nora had done with the flowers. He told her that this was not a replacement and that nothing she had built here was being unmade, that every room she had opened in him was still open, and that she was still part of how he understood this place and this life. And he told her, quietly and honestly, that he had found someone who treated that truth with the same care and respect that Clara herself would have wanted, and that this felt like something rather than nothing. The sky turned gold over the eastern fields. Joel walked back to the house. Olive was in the kitchen when he came in. She looked up from the stove and her expression was the clear, steady one he had come to think of as his favorite, and she poured him a cup of coffee and pushed it across the counter without saying anything, and the ordinariness of the gesture, the ease of it, the way they had simply arrived at this domestic ease without scheduling it, made him take 3 steps across the kitchen and stop just in front of her and look at her face in the morning light. She looked back at him, unafraid. He kissed her. It was not tentative or exploratory or uncertain. It was the kiss of 2 people who had already been honest about everything else and were simply being honest about this, warm and certain and full of the morning light, and the smell of coffee and the sounds of the Kansas ranch coming awake around them. And when it was over he pressed his forehead to hers, and she had both hands flat on his chest, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Good morning," she said finally, very dry and very warm. He laughed, low and quiet, and stayed where he was for another moment before Nora's footsteps came down the hallway and they separated like sensible adults, which made Olive's mouth curve in a way that he was going to be thinking about for the rest of the day. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at both of them with the flat, comprehensive gaze that missed nothing. "You're smiling," she told her father. "I'm allowed to smile," Joel said. Nora considered this assessment with visible skepticism. Then she sat down at the table and said, "Are there biscuits?" "There will be in 20 minutes, Olive said. "Come help." Nora got up without argument and came around the table and stood next to Olive at the counter, and Olive put the flour tin in front of her with the ease of long practice. though it had only been a few weeks, and Joel leaned against the doorframe with his coffee and watched his daughter and this woman measure flour together in the morning light, and felt something that was too large for the kitchen and the cup in his hands and the ordinary day unfolding around it. He thought it was probably joy. He had not been on familiar terms with it for long enough to be entirely certain, but he thought that was what it was. September moved into October, and the drought finally broke in the first week of October with 3 days of rain that soaked into the dry Kansas earth like a long drink. And the air afterward was the particular cool and wash-clean kind that made everything smell newly alive. And Olive stood on the porch in the morning rain with her face tilted up and her eyes closed, and her arms out slightly from her sides like she was accepting something. And Joel stood in the doorway and watched her and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that would improve on watching her, Nora appeared beside him with a biscuit and looked at Olive and then at Joel. "She likes rain," Nora said. "I can see that," Joel said. Nora was quiet for a moment. She ate her biscuit. Then she said without looking at him, "I like her." Joel looked down at his daughter. Her face was absolutely composed, the way it always was when she was saying something important, and she was looking at Olive in the rain with an expression that was quieter and younger than she usually allowed her face to be. "I know," Joel said. "You like her too," Nora said. This was not a question. "Yes," he said. Nora nodded once, with the finality of a judge issuing a ruling, and finished her biscuit and went back inside. And Joel stayed in the doorway and watched Olive in the rain for another long moment before following her in. The changes that came to the ranch over the following weeks were small and cumulative, the kind of changes that only become visible in retrospect when you look back at the person you were before them. Joel began to sleep again, actually sleep, in a way he had not managed consistently since Clara's illness. Not because the grief was gone, but because the house was no longer silent in the particular way it had been, the silence of something missing. Nora began to talk more. Not to any extraordinary degree. She was still Nora, still watchful and contained and fundamentally herself. But she began to fill in spaces in conversation that she had previously left empty, and she began to ask questions, which was perhaps the clearest indication that she felt safe again, because children only ask questions in places where they believe the answers are available. Olive, for her part, bloomed in a way that was not dramatic or sudden, but was entirely visible to Joel because he was paying very close attention. She had come to the ranch with a certain careful quality, a competence that was also slightly braced, the competence of a woman who had managed things alone for long enough that she had learned to preemptively compensate for the absence of support. Gradually, month by month, that braced quality fell away, and what was beneath it was warmer and more expansive and occasionally quite funny in the precise, dry way that made Joel laugh in the middle of sentences. She wrote letters to former students in Harrisburg and received letters back, which she read aloud at the dinner table to Nora's increasing interest, particularly the updates about Thomas, the reformed terror who was now apparently attempting to teach his younger sister to read and finding her uncooperative, a development Nora found deeply satisfying. Olive began a kitchen garden behind the house in the early spring, and Nora helped her with this in the same hovering, half-pretending not to care way she had helped with the biscuits. And by April there were seeds in neat rows and small labels written in Olive's clear, teacher's handwriting, and Nora had a section of the garden that was entirely her own jurisdiction, and about which she was intensely serious. In November, Joel had moved his things back to the larger bedroom. This had been accomplished with very little ceremony and a great deal of warmth and the particular delicate honesty that characterized everything between them. And in the morning, Olive had made coffee and set 2 cups on the table and said nothing about it. But her eyes were bright, and she kept smiling at the wall, which was frankly adorable, and which Joel absolutely did not tell her because he suspected the word adorable might not be received with the enthusiasm he intended. He told her instead that her biscuits had improved since September. She gave him a look that suggested she understood exactly what he was and was not saying, which was one of the many things he found remarkable about her. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and demanding in the way Kansas winters always were, with hard freezes and wind that came off the plains with a personal quality, as if it had a specific grievance. Joel spent long days checking the stock and keeping the water from freezing and managing the 100 small crises that a working ranch produced in cold weather. And Olive managed the house with an efficiency that was now entirely fluent. And in the evenings, the three of them were together in the warm kitchen, and the hours had a quality that Joel had stopped trying to describe precisely and simply allowed himself to inhabit. He had tried, once in December, to tell Olive what she had done for this family, and the words had come out clumsy and insufficient, which frustrated him because he generally believed in the value of saying things directly. He had said, "I want you to know what it means that you're here, what you've done for Nora, what you've done for this house. I don't have the right words for it, and that bothers me." Olive had looked at him with the most open expression he had ever seen on her face. She had said, "You don't need perfect words, Joel, I know. I want you to know," he insisted. She took his face in both hands, which she had never done before, and looked at him with her dark eyes that were full and steady and entirely without reserve. She said, "I know that you trust me with your daughter. I know that you trust me with Clara's house. I know that you talked to Clara in the field before you decided to let yourself love me, because Nora told me she saw you walking out there in the dark that morning, and I understand what that means, and you don't need to explain any of it. I know all of it. That's what I mean when I say I know." Joel was completely still for a moment. Then he said, "Nora told you that." "She mentioned it," Olive said, with the particular careful neutrality that meant she was managing her own emotion. Joel exhaled. He put his forehead down on hers and held her face in his hands and stayed like that for a while, and outside the January wind made its case against the walls of the house, and the house stood its ground, the way it always had. Spring came. The kitchen garden Olive had planted came up with a vigor that seemed like an argument, green and insistent, breaking through the Kansas dirt with a particular determination. Nora monitored her section of it every morning before breakfast with the devotion of a cattlewoman checking her herd, reporting back to the kitchen with daily updates about the progress of each row. She had planted sunflowers along the fence because Olive had shown her how, and because sunflowers were, as Nora had explained to Joel with the authority of someone who had done research, very difficult to kill, which she felt was a point in their favor. The ranch was doing better that spring than it had done in 2 years. The rain had put water back in the creek and color back in the pastures, and Joel had sold well at the autumn market and bought 2 new horses in March, one of which Nora had immediately claimed as her own and named with a seriousness that brooked no argument. The fence on the north side held. The barn roof had been repaired over the winter with Pete Calloway's help, and Pete's wife Margaret had come by for the day and had spent 3 hours with Olive in the kitchen, and had emerged with the look of a woman who had found the conversation she had been waiting for, and Margaret and Olive had been writing to each other since. In April, Olive told Joel that she was expecting. She told him in the evening in the kitchen, with Nora already in bed, and the lamp turned low and the window open to the warm spring night. She said it simply and directly, in the way she said everything, watching his face with a careful attention that suggested she was uncertain how he would receive it. Joel put down the cup in his hand very slowly. He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled her into his arms with a completeness that was not careful at all, and she made a small sound against his shoulder that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry and was entirely itself. And he held her and she held him, and outside the April night was full of spring sounds, the creek running again, the first insects of the season, the horses moving peacefully in the paddock. "Are you happy?" she asked against his shoulder. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Are you?" She pulled back enough to look at him, Her eyes were bright and her face was full and certain. "Yes," she said, "very," they told Nora the next morning at breakfast. Nora received this information with the measuring silence she gave to important things. She looked at Olive, she looked at her father, she looked at the biscuit on her plate. Then she looked back up at Olive and said, "Is it going to be a girl?" "We don't know yet," Olive said. Nora appeared to consider the various implications of this uncertainty. Then she said, "If it's a boy, I get to name him." "That seems like a conversation for all of us," Joel said. Nora looked at him with an expression that suggested she found his position unconvincing. "We'll all have ideas," Olive said diplomatically. "And we'll listen to each other's ideas. That's how decisions in this family work." Nora absorbed this. Then she nodded with the deliberate fairness of someone conceding a point, while reserving the right to advocate strongly for their position later, which was so precisely Clara's particular style of compromise that Joel had to look at the window for a moment. When he looked back, Olive was watching him with the gentle, understanding expression she sometimes wore when she caught him in one of those moments of recognition, and she reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and Nora watched this with the flat, comprehensive gaze that missed nothing and then went back to her biscuit. "I think you should name it something good," Nora said. "Not something boring." "Noted," Joel said. The spring became summer. Olive grew in the way of a woman who was fundamentally practical about everything, including her own body, without complaint, and with the particular patience of someone who understood that some things required simply waiting them out. She continued to manage the house and the garden and the accounts and Nora's increasingly advanced reading lessons, adjusting as necessary, without making the adjustment a subject of conversation. And Joel watched her with a steady admiration that he had long since stopped trying to keep at a measured distance. They talked in the evening still, every evening, with the same quality of conversation they had fallen into in those first careful weeks. Open and direct, and not afraid of the difficult things, but also funny now, and warm, and punctuated with the specific shorthand that develops between two people who have been paying close attention to each other. Olive had a way of looking at him over the top of whatever she was reading that communicated several complete sentences in one glance, and Joel had apparently developed, without intending to, a particular expression that Olive could read precisely enough to say, "You're trying to figure out how to say something difficult. Just say it," before he had opened his mouth, which was occasionally inconvenient and mostly a relief. Pete Calloway came by in June with news from town, because Pete was the person who brought news and knew he was the person who brought news, and had accepted this role in the community with the particular cheerfulness of a man who enjoyed knowing things. He told them that the new dry goods store in Caldwell had finally opened, and that the prices were better than the old one, and that the sheriff's new deputy was a young man from Colorado who had started 3 small arguments in his first week but seemed competent, and that the circuit preacher was getting too old for the circuit, and there was some discussion about whether Caldwell might get a permanent church. He also told them, with less cheerfulness, that there had been trouble on the Edwards Ranch, 40 miles south, where a land dispute had turned ugly in a way that involved a lawyer from Wichita and a great deal of money, and had left 2 families in a situation that was not going to resolve itself tidily. He shook his head over this with the gravity it deserved, and said that the law out here was still young, and that the law out here still sometimes lost to money. And Joel agreed with him, and Olive listened with the focused attention she gave to injustice, which was the full weight of her intelligence and her moral seriousness combined. And afterward she said quietly to Joel that she thought one of the things this part of the country needed most was better legal recourse for working people against landowners with lawyers. And Joel agreed, and they talked about it for a long time, which was one of the many ways in which Olive Brooks was not the woman Joel had expected when he had written that cautious letter to a correspondence agency in St. Louis. She was more, in every direction. The baby came in late November. He came into the world on a cold Tuesday night with a great deal of decisiveness and volume, and Mrs. Hartley was there to help, which was good because Joel was not entirely steady in those hours, not from fear. Olive was strong and capable, and the birth was as uncomplicated as these things can be, but because the experience of holding his son for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom, this small, furious, new person who had arrived with such determination, hit him somewhere deep, and ancient that he had not expected to feel quite so completely. He had named him Henry. This was a compromise reached after several weeks of negotiation involving all three existing members of the Whitfield household, during which Nora had advocated with considerable passion for the name James, which was the name of the hero of a story Olive had read aloud to her that fall, and Olive had offered William as a possibility, and Joel had quietly suggested Henry, which had been his grandfather's name, a man he remembered with the particular vividness of early childhood memory. Big hands. A slow laugh, a way of being absolutely present in whatever room he occupied. Nora had eventually accepted Henry on the condition that the middle name would be her suggestion, and so the baby was Henry James Whitfield, and Nora had looked at him in his mother's arms with the solemn, enormous gravity of someone encountering something they had not fully anticipated and said, "He's very small." "He'll grow," Olive said. "You're sure?" Nora said. "Quite sure," Olive said, with the dry certainty that always made Nora take her at her word. Henry grew. He grew at the particular pace of robust, frontier-born children, and by spring he was awake at extraordinary hours and deeply interested in everything, and following Nora around the house with his eyes long before he could follow her physically, which seemed to amuse Nora in a way she was very careful not to appear too delighted by in front of witnesses. But Joel had caught her more than once, sitting beside the cradle in the afternoon and reading aloud to Henry from one of her books, very quietly, in the voice she used when she thought no one could hear her. He had never told her he'd heard. Some things were not his to claim. Olive recovered from the birth with the same practical competence she brought to everything, and by February she was back in the garden with the determination of someone who had a plan that was not going to wait on her behalf. She and Nora expanded the kitchen garden that spring, breaking new ground along the south side of the house, and Nora had allocated an entire new section to sunflowers, which she had decided were her personal domain, and which she tended with the proprietary attention of a professional. The summer of 1879 was nothing like the summer of 1878. The rain came at intervals through the season, not too much and not too little, and the grass was green and the creek ran all summer, and the cattle were fat, and the kitchen garden produced with an abundance that Olive navigated with the creative efficiency of a woman who had grown up knowing that food did not waste itself. She put up preserves in the autumn with Nora's increasingly competent help, and the shelves in the pantry filled with the particular bright colors of preserved summer red tomatoes, yellow corn, green beans, dark plum jam, and Joel stood in the pantry one September afternoon counting jars, and felt an overwhelming, wordless gratitude for the fullness of this particular life. He found Olive in the kitchen and he told her, in the careful, direct way he had learned from her, that he was grateful. That he had been grateful for a long time, but wanted to say it specifically. That she had given this house something it had been missing that went beyond what he had asked for or expected, and that he understood she had also built something for herself here and that he was glad about that too, glad it was real for her, glad it was not just a service she was providing but a life she was actually living. She put down what she was doing and looked at him for a long, warm moment. Then she said, "Joel, this is my home." 4 words, entirely sufficient. He crossed the kitchen and held her, the way he had been holding her for months now, with the particular ease of two people whose bodies have learned each other's geography, and she leaned into him with her head against his shoulder, and they stood like that in the autumn kitchen with the smell of jam and coffee and dry grass coming through the open window. And from somewhere down the hall Nora was reading to Henry in her quiet, careful voice, and Henry was making his small contented sounds that meant he was listening. and the ranch stood solid around them in the September afternoon. 340 acres of good Kansas land, holding its people the way good land does when people have loved it properly. The years after that were not without difficulty, because no years are without difficulty, and the Wild West in 1879 and 1880 and beyond was a place where difficulty came in many forms: hard winters, dry summers, the slow churning uncertainty of land values and cattle prices, and the always present awareness that the frontier was changing, filling in, becoming something more structured and less open, which was sometimes a good thing and sometimes a loss, and usually both at once. There was a difficult winter in 1880 that was hard on the stock and harder on the finances, and Joel and Olive spent a long, honest evening at the kitchen table with the account books between them, and mapped out a plan that they then executed together with the same focused, unhurried teamwork they brought to everything that mattered. There was a summer of trouble with a neighboring rancher who shared a fence line with Joel, and had ideas about where that fence line should be that did not match the surveyor's assessment, and the dispute required 2 trips to Caldwell and a great deal of the particular patience Joel needed most when he was most inclined to dispense with it. Olive managed this with him, not by softening him exactly, but by thinking alongside him with the sharp, legal-minded intelligence she had applied to the Harrisburg schoolroom, and applied equally to the problems of the ranch. And she found an old document in a county record's ledger that resolved the dispute in their favor. And the neighboring rancher was not happy about it, but he was wrong and the document was correct, and the fence stayed where it was. Joel had looked at Olive after the final meeting in Caldwell with an expression that was equal parts admiration and something that was simply entirely in love. "Where did you learn to read a land survey?" he asked. "In Ohio," she said. "My father had a dispute with his neighbor for 7 years before he found someone who could read the original deed. I watched the whole thing and decided I would learn to read documents myself." "You never stop surprising me," he said. "I should hope not," she said. Nora turned 11 in the fall of 1881, and she was becoming herself with the purposeful intensity of a girl who had always known the direction she was going and was only waiting to grow into her stride. She was clever and forthright and entirely unintimidated by things that intimidated other children her age, and she was a reader of formidable depth for her years, which Olive had cultivated with the same steady, patient consistency she brought to everything she taught. She had also, over the years, arrived at a relationship with Olive that was its own thing, distinct from what it had been in the beginning, not a daughter to a substitute mother, but something more lateral, more collaborative, the relationship of 2 people who respected each other's intelligence and had found in each other a particular kind of companionship that was both deeply affectionate and utterly honest. Olive had never tried to be Clara. She had said so at the beginning, and she had kept that promise in every way that mattered, and Nora had understood this, perhaps sooner than either of the adults had realized, and had allowed herself, in the space that understanding created, to simply love Olive for who Olive was, which was entirely worth loving. Joel watched the 2 of them sometimes walking back from the garden together with their arms full of the late summer harvest, or sitting side by side at the table with books, or in the occasional serious discussion that they had from which he was not excluded, but in which he was mostly a listener, and he thought that Clara would have been pleased with this. Not merely resigned to it or at peace with it, but genuinely, warmly pleased, because Clara had always known the difference between something being replaced and something being continued, and this was continued. This was the life she had built here, going on, growing, becoming something she might not have predicted but would have recognized in its essential character, the same love for the land, and the same commitment to honesty, and the same belief that the people in this house deserved the full weight of your attention and your care. He visited the field by the creek still, occasionally, not regularly, not with the urgency of grief, but with the quieter regularity of someone who had not forgotten and did not intend to. He always told Clara about Nora. He told her about Henry, who was walking and talking and causing a specific variety of chaos that seemed connected to an unusually intense curiosity about how things worked, which had resulted in 2 disassembled clocks and 1 incident with a chicken that everyone had agreed not to speak of in detail. He told her that the land was good and that the house was full and that he was happy, and this last thing he told her without apology, and with the full conviction of a man who had learned the hard way that happiness was not a betrayal of grief, but its resolution. In the spring of 1882, Olive told him she was expecting again. This time Nora received the news with considerably more composure, having processed the concept of younger siblings once already, and she asked with immediate practicality whether the baby would arrive before or after the sunflowers came up. And when Olive told her after, Nora nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose agricultural schedule had been preserved. The baby was a girl. She arrived in late autumn of 1882, smaller than Henry had been but no less definite in her opinions, and they named her Clara Rose Whitfield, which had been Joel's suggestion, offered quietly, and with the particular careful honesty he brought to the things that mattered most to him. Olive had said yes immediately without hesitation. Nora had said, "That's a good name." Henry, who was nearly 3 and had views on everything, had said, "Baby," with immense satisfaction, and then attempted to give the baby a block, which was his highest form of generosity. Joel had sat in the bedroom that evening with his daughter, Clara Rose, in his arms, and looked at this small, new, entirely specific person who carried his first wife's name, and had his second wife's dark eyes, and was already, in the particular way of babies who have very clear opinions about being held, making it known that she intended to be exactly herself. He held her and felt the full, enormous, quiet weight of everything this house contained, and he was grateful for every part of it. Olive came and sat beside him on the bed, leaning against his shoulder with the ease of 4 years of learning each other's weight, and looked at their daughter with the focused, present attention she gave to things she loved. And Joel turned his head and kissed her hair, and she tilted her head against him, and they stayed like that without speaking, with the baby between them and the lamp turned low and the Kansas autumn pressing quietly against the walls of the house. "You're thinking about something," Olive said after a while, because she always knew. "Several things," he said. "Good things. Very good things," he said. She turned her head to look at him, and her dark eyes were warm and entirely familiar and still capable, even now, even after 4 years of doing something to his chest that he had entirely stopped trying to be practical about. "Tell me," she said. So he did. He told her what he was thinking, which was that he had come to Kansas at 22 with money saved, and a plan, and the particular determination of a young man who believes that if you work hard enough you can build anything. He had built a ranch, and he had built a life, and he had loved a woman and lost her, and thought for a time that the loss was the final accounting. He told her that writing that letter to a correspondence agency in St. Louis had been the most practical thing he had ever done, and had turned out to be the least practical thing, in the sense that practical no longer felt like the right word for what their life was. He told her that Nora had given her wildflowers on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1878, and that he had been standing at the corner of the barn when it happened, and that in that moment he had known, in the way that you know things before you have words for them, that his life was going to be different from that day forward in ways he was not going to be able to manage or arrange. He told her that he was glad about all of it. Olive listened to all of this the way she always did, with the full weight of her attention and her intelligence and her open, unhurried presence, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I read your letter in Harrisburg on a Thursday evening in June. I had told myself I wasn't going to write to anyone. I had told myself the whole arrangement was probably foolish." She paused. And then I read the part where you said you wanted someone who was honest and kind. And I put the letter down, and I looked out the window of my room at the schoolhouse street, and I thought, I can do both of those things. And this man has said specifically that those are the things he needs. And that seemed to me like a very good sign. It was a good sign, Joel said. Yes, she said. It turned out to be the best one. Baby Clara Rose made a small sound of agreement or possibly dissatisfaction. It was genuinely difficult to tell. And Henry's voice came from down the hall asking Nora something about stars. And Nora's voice answered with the patient, lecturing tone she used when she was enjoying being the authority on something. And the house held all of it. The voices and the warmth and the lamplight and the smell of the kitchen and the big Kansas dark, outside the windows and the land stretching in every direction. Enormous and enduring and entirely theirs. Joel held his daughter and his wife leaned against his shoulder, and outside in the dry autumn field near the creek the last of the summer's sunflowers stood straight in the dark, the ones Nora had planted and tended all season, their tall stems anchored in the good Kansas earth, still standing. The ranch was full. The house was home. And in the morning Nora would be up before anyone, moving through the kitchen with the quick, purposeful stride she had inherited from her mother, and she would pour herself a cup of water and go out to check on her sunflowers before breakfast. And she might pick a few of them, the tallest ones, the ones that had opened the widest and were beginning to bow their heavy heads toward the ground at the end of their season, and she might bring them inside and put them in the jar on the kitchen table. The old blue jar that Olive had found at the bottom of a box when she arrived, and had washed and set on the table where it had lived ever since. And the morning would begin the way mornings had learned to begin in this house, with coffee and biscuits and the sounds of children and the particular smell of Kansas October coming through the open door. And Joel Whitfield would come in from the barn and find his family at the kitchen table, and he would stand in the doorway for a moment, the way he had stood at the corner of that barn on a Tuesday in August, watching a small hand extend a fistful of yellow flowers toward the woman who had become everything. And he would feel the full, impossible, entirely ordinary weight of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He would hang his hat on the hook. He would sit down at the table. He would be home.